Again, when we read the scriptures as a whole and we look at all the verses that have to do with the subject of Sabbath, there is no way that anyone can come away with the idea that it exists strictly for the Jewish people. Another point that is worthy of consideration while I continue to present these reasons why the Sabbath isn't just for the Jews, is that with it being instituted in the Garden of Eden prior to the fall of man, understand that those are the same exact conditions and the same exact people that were there when the institution of marriage came about. Now, Christians today exalt the sanctity of marriage and they consider it a Christian institution. But somehow the reasoning for that gets lost when the subject of the Sabbath comes up. And I wonder why that is. Just like marriage, the Sabbath was given to the same people at the same time. But somehow Christianity has decided that it doesn't apply to them. Well, if that's true, then that means marriage also does not apply to Christians, and we need to give that up and leave it to the Jews as well. However, you would never hear that argument put forward. Obviously, this position is inconsistent. Okay, and quite contradictory. Now, what we need to look at, though, is that sin had not yet entered the world, of course, when the Sabbath and marriage both were instituted. As such, it is not and cannot be a type anticipating an antitype. Okay, those the types, of course, were the various shadows and typical observances that were instituted as a result of sin and pointed forward to the deliverance of man from sin by the Messiah. Okay? That is why, for instance, the animal sacrifices happened. Okay? They pointed forward to the coming Messiah. Okay? They themselves did not atone for sin. Okay? They were looking forward to the blood of the Messiah to atone for sin. The lamb that they would slaughter was a type. Okay? When Christ came, type met antitype, and of course that practice is now dissolved. There would have been no animal sacrifices had there not been sin, but the same cannot be said about the Sabbath. The Sabbath existed prior to sin entering into this world. It is not a type. As such, it doesn't have an antitype. As such, Christ could not have fulfilled it based upon that basis, nor did Christ seek to fulfill it in the way that it's being used in the Christian community. So that's just something to bear in mind, and I'll explore that idea here a little bit later on. There's another argument, though, that's worthy of note, and that is that the Bible never calls the Sabbath the Jewish Sabbath or the Sabbath of the Jews. But let it suffice to say at this point that the Sabbath is not strictly for the Jewish people. It's not Jewish. It's godly. God created it. God made it holy. Okay? Let's not forget that Luke, the Bible writer Luke, was a Gentile. Okay? As a Gentile writer of the New Testament, and you can look in the book of Luke and, actually the book of Acts in particular, which Luke wrote as well. Luke was very careful in his writings to specify things that were particular to the Jewish people. Okay? For instance, in Acts 10:22, he talks of the nation of the Jews. In Acts 12:11, he talks about the people of the Jews. In Acts 10:39, he talks about the land of the Jews. And of course, in Acts 14:1, he mentions the synagogue of the Jews. But you know, Luke, in all of the times that he talks about Sabbath in his writings, not one time does he call it the Jewish Sabbath, or the Sabbath of the Jewish people. Now that should be a great big red glowing neon sign for someone who wants to use the argument that the Bible teaches that the Sabbath was only for the Jews. It's just simply not there. Okay. Now, not to belabor the point, I want to go ahead and go on with the next argument. And remember I said that Christ, earlier at the beginning of this video I mentioned the different things that I was going to use to argue why the seventh-day Sabbath is not exclusively for the Jewish people, but is in fact for all of God's people. My fourth argument is that Christ said in Mark 2, verse 27, "And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Now, let me ask you a very intelligent and very apparent question. Who did Jesus, just now in that verse, who did Jesus say that the Sabbath was made for? In my reading, it spells M-A-N, not J-E-W. Okay? Sabbath was made for man. It doesn't say that the Jewish people. It doesn't say the descendants of Jacob. It says it was made for man, and of course, man in this passage obviously means all of mankind, not just one individual. It was made for all of mankind, and if these clear words by our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, if those clear words are somehow confusing, I don't know what else I could say that would alleviate the confusion on the part of Christians. Christ's own words say that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's not the other way around, okay? Now, earlier I mentioned in my first video that I've studied with people of all different denominations, and of that list that I mentioned Catholics. Now, I'm not one, frankly, to quote very often any pope, okay? However, in Deus Domini, Pope John Paul, in his letter, and of course that's dated May 31st of 1998, Pope John Paul understands that this Sabbath commandment applies to all men. Now, he does, of course, make the mistake that the Sabbath is Sunday and not Saturday, okay? But if we can set that mistake to the side for just a moment and take a look at some of the other things that the Pope had to say on this, I think many Christians would benefit from it. And let me quote here for you. The Sabbath precept is rooted in the depths of God's plan. This is why, unlike many other precepts, it is not within the context of strictly cultic stipulations, but within the Decalogue, the 10 words, which represents the very pillars of the moral life inscribed in the human heart. In setting this commandment within the context of the basic structure of ethics, Israel, and then the Church, declare that they consider it not just a matter of community religious discipline, but a defining and indelible expression of our relationship with God, announced and expounded by biblical revelation. This is the perspective within which Christians need to rediscover this precept today. Now you see, the Pope understands that the Sabbath commandment is not optional for Christians. It is no more optional than thou shalt not murder, or taking the Lord's name in vain, or coveting. Okay? It's one of the 10. He understands that that it goes to the very core of our church, that the Sabbath command. Now, his reasoning is that since the Sabbath is set within the 10 Commandments, that it is placed on an equal tier with thou shalt not kill. The Sabbath commandment cannot be limited to just the Jewish people based on that alone.